Oh, good you're here, because today we're going to talk about what you do if and when the president declares martial law. This is part of our Prepare Ya, Don't Scare Ya series, and we'll lean heavy on an article called Can Martial Law Happen in America? That is the title of a December 5th opinion piece by David French for the New York Times. In this article, he details the aftermath of December 3rd, 2024's news that the president of South Korea had declared martial law. As French puts it, he suspended political activity in one of the world's most advanced and prosperous democracies and attempted to place the media under government control. Seemingly confused and surprised troops struggled to contain a rebellious National Assembly, which voted immediately to end military rule, but not before a series of chaotic scenes that shocked the nation. As you're already aware, martial law didn't last long in South Korea. In fact, it was over in just a couple of hours. But just from the sounds of it, you might think that this is some kind of ridiculous political fan fiction, something that wouldn't be out of place on a show like, say, Veep. Oopsie doodle, I just did a little martial law, and it's probably all Selena Meyer's fault.
You do your best, you try to serve the people, and then they just you over.
Yep. Yet it definitely happened, and it sent political shockwaves all across the globe due to the audacity of a world leader declaring martial law in what seems to be an otherwise stable nation. And that got a lot of folks, including David French, asking the question, could martial law happen even in the United States? Does the president have the authority to do that? Good God, does Donald Trump have the authority to do that? And the short answer is yes. The longer answer is yes, but there are supposed to be conditions. But in the time we live in, what are conditions? First, hello, my name is V, and this is my YouTube channel where I dive deep under the desk to find the crumpled paper trails of long-forgotten history, while also gently reminding you that when it seems like everything is going to be awful, there is almost always a small light at the end of the tunnel. Make sure to like and subscribe, because today we're going to be talking about martial law. Let me tell you something. Despite what the prevalence of the term might lead you to believe, martial law has no established definition. There are some loose definitions and ideas about what martial law is, but constitutionally speaking, there is not actually a set idea of what constitutes a martial law throughout the world or even within just the United States. Martial law is basically the suspension of this thing called habeas corpus, aka when martial law is invoked, you are no longer promised the right to a hearing in a trial on lawful imprisonment. You are no longer promised supervision of the law enforcement will happen by the judiciary, because all of that gets replaced by supervision of law enforcement by the military. You see, the military isn't allowed to turn their weapons or force on civilians unless there is martial law. And that's like how it works here, but martial law is an everywhere thing. I mean, loosely speaking, martial law is when anybody or any body of government that is considered the military commander of a country is given unbridled authority over how the law is enforced. They can even get pretty much unchecked power over the people. And it is bad for dissenters. You know, like ain't no protesting safely or fairly during martial law. And martial law is only ever enforced or supposed to be enforced when the country simply has no other choice to protect its national security and interests. But who gets to decide if there's no other choice? The people in the seat of power who want more power? Cool. As the Brennan Center for Justice puts it, martial law describes a power that in an emergency allows the military to push aside civilian authorities and exercise jurisdiction over the population of a particular area. Laws are enforced by soldiers rather than local police, and policy decisions are made by military officers rather than elected officials. People who are accused of crimes are brought before a military tribunal rather than an ordinary civilian court. In short, the military is in charge. So yeah, if Trump were to invoke martial law, then he and Pete Hegseth, I guess, would be calling all the shots unchecked. That seems cool. Well, in case you guys are listening, and this cannot be stressed enough, martial law is meant in case of an emergency only. I mean, emergencies can be frequent, I suppose. According to Joseph Nunn at the Brennan Center for Justice, martial law has been declared at least 68 times in the United States. And sometimes it's like a partial martial law, and sometimes it's just like a little baby state martial law, state only. Martial law has been called twice for war or invasions, 7 times for domestic war or an insurrection, 11 times due to a riot or civil unrest, 4 times during a natural disaster, 15 times for other reasons, and a whopping 29 times for labor disputes. So it looks like the easiest way to enact martial law is to get pissed about your paychecks. The government puts that down right away. Now, it's not just Trump that can declare martial law. Governors can declare martial law in their state because they command the National Guard of their state. Presidents can declare martial law because technically they're the commander-in-chief of the entire U.S. military. And Congress can declare martial law because, and I had to look this up because I was like, what? According to Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress includes the power to provide for a common defense, declare war, raise and support an army, make rules and regulations for the military, and purchase land for military bases. But Congress can raise and support an army and a navy. Just an army and a navy, though? Like, what about Space Force or Air Force or the Marines or the Coasties? I don't actually know what they do during martial law. I couldn't find anything on it. So if you know what those branches do during martial law, please put it in the comments, okay? I'm like trying so hard to learn. Now, the first time martial law was officially declared in the United States was when then General Andrew Jackson declared martial law in New Orleans in 1814 during the War of 1812. General Andrew Jackson, was he president then? No. This declaration lasted 2 or 3 months, depending on where you read, and consisted of Jackson censoring the press, enforcing a citywide curfew, and arresting and detaining any citizens without criminally charging them. And I want you to remember, every president gets to decorate the Oval Office, and whose portrait was hung front and center in Donald Trump's Oval Office. Who is Donald Trump's favorite former president? Correct, Andrew Jackson. He idolizes him. Now, this martial law called by Andrew Jackson was reportedly later referred to by the Louisiana Supreme Court as trampling upon the Constitution and laws of our country. And it was referred to by V. Speer as yet another example of history's most underrated psychopath overstepping his authority to be one of the most insane men ever elected president. And he is the model for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is obsessed with the guy. He loves this guy. You see, Jackson fully believed that his actions were just. They were just as a means to stop the British from attacking, even though the war had already ended. That statement that came from the Louisiana Supreme Court calling his martial law unconstitutional also came with a $1,000 fine, which was like a lot of money back then, and a local judge holding Jackson in contempt of court. As Joseph Nunn at Brennan puts it, Jackson paid the fine and he went about his life for 27 years. But then, after Jackson was no longer president, he began hounding his former buddies in Congress to, and I am not making this up, get him a refund on the $1,000 fine he had to pay, which is like kind of objectively funny. Or at least it would be if it didn't serve an ulterior motive. Quote, the ensuing congressional refund debates marked the beginning of a shift in how Americans understood martial law. By pursuing a refund, Jackson hoped to set a precedent for, as one historian put it, the legitimacy of violating the Constitution and civil liberties in times of national emergency. And he got exactly what he wanted. Congress enacted the Refund Bill in February of 1844, symbolically endorsing Jackson's 3-month-long imposition of martial law in New Orleans, almost 30 years after it had ended. Andrew Jackson committing a coup and then getting fined, only to later ask for a refund, is like kind of hilarious to me. But it did open the floodgates for a ton of complete or partial declarations of martial law that came after. Martial law was declared in Rhode Island in 1842 following a revolt by a man named Thomas Dorr over restrictions placed on Rhode Island voters. In response, the General Assembly themselves assembled the state militia to keep Dorr and company at bay. Now, unlike Jackson's martial law, this one was actually approved by the Supreme Court in 1840 in a case known as Luther v. Borden, where the Chief Justice wrote that the states had the right to defend themselves by declaring martial law in the name of, quote, public safety. Keep that one in your mind for a little bit later. Notably, even though this legitimized martial law, Samuel Strom at Find Law points out that this ruling does not account for the legal basis of declaring martial law, the scope of martial law, when or under what circumstances states can impose martial law, and who exactly can declare and impose martial law. In addition, the courts did not hold, as never held, that the federal government can impose martial law. So, what? Since then, we've seen martial law declared countless times and for numerous reasons, and it seems like, where did it come from? Now, the government has not declared martial law technically fully since 1944, and the last time a state declared martial law was all the way back in 1963 in Maryland. And so that might have you thinking, well, could it still be enacted? And I feel like I've heard about martial law being enacted many times since 1963. Maybe, but not officially. The last official one was 1963. Could it happen now? Again, Maybe. There's a lot of legal questions that we still don't have answers for when it comes to martial law in the United States, especially at the federal level. Martial law is still an ill-defined, oft misunderstood boogeyman, not unlike Man-Bear-Pig from South Park. You don't know what Man-Bear-Pig is? Okay. South Park created this character, Man-Bear-Pig, because they were trying to make fun of former Vice President Al Gore.
Al Gore?
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
I don't know if you remember us, but we're the kids you got to help try and capture Man-Bear-Pig. Man-Bear-Pig is real, and he's killing lots of people in our town.
Oh, sucks for you.
Al Gore was out here talking about global warming, and they thought he was crazy, so they created this creature, Man-Bear-Pig, where whoever talked about the Man-Bear-Pig looked like a complete fool and totally crazy, and this was their way of kind of like trolling the vice president for talking about global climate change. Now, famously, later, the people from South Park changed their mind about this, and they recognized that climate change is real, and they felt bad about making fun of Al Gore. And so the way that they fixed it was to prove the existence of Man-Bear-Pig. This was their way of like setting it straight. But anyway, this has nothing to do with this. Okay, they said make longer videos, V, and now I'm like lost in the sauce. Back to martial law. It's easy to misunderstand martial law as some nebulous idea of society where law and order is held by one man and one man alone. Or even laughing off entirely like Trey and Matt did for climate change on that South Park episode. This fantasy thing, right? The truth is kind of somewhere in the middle. Do you remember that David Gross newsletter I talked about at the beginning of this, where Gross says that the United States has no clear constitutional mechanism for a president to simply declare military rule? Now, state governors do have the ability to declare martial law in the event of an emergency, but governors can't go around the federal constitution either, and any declaration of state military control is still subject to judicial review. Judicial review by who? Okay? Judicial review by the SCOTUS, by the state federal judges. Are you guys feeling good about that? Gross continues by saying, history sometimes demonstrates that American leaders will sometimes press their war powers beyond the constitutional breaking point. So when Roosevelt declared martial law in Hawaii, they found that defensible, but his internment of Japanese Americans was not. Even worse, there's a statutory basis for military intervention in domestic affairs, and the statute, called the Insurrection Act, is also very poorly drafted. I mean, you can kind of call it America's most dangerous law. I can see you're sweating. Me too. We just have a little bit more to get through here, so hold on tight. The Insurrection Act sounds familiar because it is. This is the same act that Trump wanted to enact during the George Floyd protests of 2020. This is a law that's almost as old as the United States, and it allows the United States president to deploy troops into the streets of America to maintain their idea of law and order and balance. Now, the smarty pants folks at NPR summarized the Insurrection Act as granting the power to the president to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy, which is direct language, but it's still pretty broad, okay? It's broad, and Trump knows that it's broad, which is why he openly said that he regretted not enforcing the Insurrection Act back in 2020. Now, David Gross also points out that whenever you hear discussions surrounding border use and the word invasion, it is likely so that the state can point to Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. This section denies states the power to engage in war unless they are invaded, which is why they use the word invading. And the section before, Article 1, Section 9, protects habeas corpus unless in case of rebellion or invasion where the public safety may require it. So you can see what they're starting to set up here, okay? They're setting up this idea of a border crisis. They are projecting what's happening at our southern border mostly as an invasion. I mean, are you doing that to invoke the constitutional rights you have to start a war or lock people up without trials? Starting to look a little spooky here. But let's just say that, for instance, Trump, or really any president, says, I'm just going to do this shit right now. I'm just going to call martial law right now because I feel like it. What would happen? Would it look like what happened in South Korea? No. In South Korea, when the people started pushing back, their president backed off. And here, our president has said he regrets not sicking the military on dissenters. So no, it would not be the same. Now, if you want an idea of what martial law on a federal level would look like, think about any states of emergency that have ever been called in America. Whether it's an enforced curfew, the presence of the National Guard, having forbidden areas to explore, or even civilian patrols and backyard militias on the street, this is a good look at what I'd like to call easy mode martial law. In that case, even just walking up the street to get gas after curfew hours could have got you tried by a military tribunal. In addition, martial law is the erosion of your constitutional rights in which the military can, and likely will, take whatever supplies they need from you. That could be water, food, ammunition, or even your house. That's right, Third Amendment, the right to not give quarter to the army, that's gone during martial law. The army could come in and take your house if they felt like it was part of their mission. Still, it's worth noting that despite all of this, it would require a whole lot of cards to be stacked to make Trump's martial law mansion. And like any good house of cards, it could be knocked over with the slightest deviation, okay? Number one, there's nothing in the Constitution supporting martial law. Only the president's use of deploying troops. Number two, the Supreme Court has not, at least as of this time, decided whether the federal government is even empowered to enact martial law on a broad national scale. And number three, any actions taken by a president in the name of martial law would be subject to judicial review. And I already know you're like, but he bought the SCOTUS, I don't trust the judges. Yeah. Now, even at the state level, the federal government is often like, yeah, it sounds good to me when governors enforce martial law in their state. The martial law can be overturned or even restricted by a federal court. So if you're worried about having a rogue Republican governor enact martial law as soon as Trump is president or something, there are some levers to stop that. In conclusion, martial law, despite Trump's insistence on invoking the Insurrection Act, is not likely, okay? He probably wants it to happen. He probably thinks it's inevitable. He may even try to convince you that there's nothing you can do to stop it. That's how authoritarianism works. They try to get you to submit to the authority in advance or to think that things are hopeless in advance. They are not. There are many factors preventing him from enforcing martial law that can be held up even with a Republican majority in the Senate and Congress. Now, if you're going to leave comments and say, you're just picking on Trump, it's also because he deserves it, okay? But it does go for any president. This could happen in the future, but we've just never really had to worry about a president saying they were going to invoke martial law because they never did. They didn't. I think our founders thought that the people who would be elected president would be much more responsible and judicious than what we have going on right now. So we're kind of in an unprecedented space in that way. Now, Steve Vladeck at the Washington Post did an analysis of different times the Insurrection Act had been invoked and noted that in 2020, when Trump tried to do it, it had been 28 years since the last time it had happened, okay? And if you're familiar with the 1992 Los Angeles riots, this is a terrible story and probably a video for another time. But in short, a black motorist named Rodney King was attacked by 4 police officers. The event was filmed and shown around the world, and yet the officers were acquitted. What followed were 6 days of riots and dissent in protest of those officers being acquitted for that crime. There were attacks on innocent bystanders and police alike. At the request of Governor Pete Wilson, George H.W. Bush sent in troops to California to stop the riots. Now, despite this, what happened in that case was not even martial law. It was just a state of emergency in which the power by the government and governor is not nearly as absolute as it would be under a martial law. But back then, invoking the Insurrection Act was so unpopular that it never got done since. They invoked it for the Rodney King riots, and it was so poorly received by the public that no one wanted to do it again. As we know, tradition doesn't really mean much to Trump, so time will tell on whether he invokes the Insurrection Act or martial law straight out. But one thing is for sure this time. I'm Al Gore, and Trump declaring martial law is my man-bear pig. It could be real, or it could be a figment of our warped imaginations. We're not going to know until it happens or doesn't happen. In conclusion, if you were wishing that your daughter would have brought home a brave American soldier for Christmas, well, you might get that soldier after all, but he'll be sleeping in your bed because there'll be no Third Amendment and the military will run the nation. Oh gosh, I've done my part to scare half the internet. It is time for this banana to split. Good night.